The dog lay in the mud like a discarded shadow, ribs pressing against skin so thin it looked like torn paper. Her breath came in ragged pulls, each one sounding as if it might be her last. Rain had soaked the earth all night, turning the alley into a shallow grave of puddles and trash. But she had not moved. People passed. Some glanced, most did not. She was a ghost in plain sight, a body mistaken for already gone. When a car slowed, headlights spilling across her fragile frame, her eyes flickered open. Dull amber, glazed but still alive. For the first time in hours, she lifted her head, just enough to show that somewhere in the broken machinery of her body, a spark still burned. Weak, fragile, barely a whisper of life, but still there. What no one yet knew was that this tiny motion, this tremor of will, would unravel into something far greater. Because this dog, thought too weak to live, was about to begin the fight of her life. The rain did not fall in sheets that night, it fell in needles. Thin, piercing droplets that stung against skin and turned the cracked pavement into a mirror of broken reflections. In the corner of a narrow alley where a single rusted gutter leaked relentlessly, a dog lay pressed against the wall, curled in on herself as though the world might forget her if she made herself small enough. Her fur, once white, was mottled with dirt and ash-gray stains, clinging in clumps to bones that jutted sharp beneath the surface. Most who passed mistook her for a discarded rag, or worse, did not see her at all. The alley smelled of mildew and rotting food, and the constant drip of rain played an indifferent rhythm over the scene. But if someone had crouched close enough, if they had dared, they would have seen her ribs shudder faintly with every fragile breath, each one rattling like a hinge about to break. It was the beam of headlights that first cut across her body, not out of intention but accident. A car slowed at the corner, its driver peering down the narrow cut between buildings. For a moment, the animal's frail form was caught in the light. The driver hesitated, one hand hovering over the wheel, debating whether to stop. The rain beat louder. The dog's eyes flickered open just then, glazed amber, clouded with exhaustion but undeniable in their plea. That flicker undid the hesitation. The car door slammed, echoing against the damp brick walls. Shoes splashed through shallow puddles. A figure crouched low, hand trembling as it hovered above her soaked frame. She did not move, not even to flinch. The rescuer whispered, voice tight, as though afraid sound alone might shatter her. "Oh my God, you're still here." Her jacket was shrugged off, draped gently across her tiny body. The touch of fabric coaxed a soft whimper from her throat, a sound that carried more weight than any scream. The rescuer's eyes, blurred with rain and tears, indistinguishable. For one fragile moment, the alley ceased to exist. It was only the dying breath of a creature everyone else had forgotten, and the desperate resolve of one stranger who refused to walk away. With hands shaking, the rescuer lifted her, feeling just how insubstantial she had become. Feather-light, yet heavy with the knowledge that this bundle of bones might not last another hour. Against the chest, pressed into warmth, the dog's weak heart fluttered like a bird trying to rise through storm winds. The rain did not ease. The world did not pause. But as the car door shut again and tires pulled away, carrying her out of the alley, something shifted. For the first time in what might have been days, maybe weeks, she was no longer alone in the rain. The house was dim, only a single lamp burning on the kitchen counter, casting a halo of golden light against the storm outside. The rescuer carried her inside wrapped in a towel that smelled faintly of detergent and wood smoke. As the cloth unwound, the full state of her condition revealed itself. So thin the outline of every rib carved valleys across her sides, paws raw and cracked, ears torn from old fights or accidents long past. She looked less like a living creature and more like the brittle memory of one. Laid on the blanket, she did not move, only blinked slowly, as though even the effort of closing her eyes and reopening them cost more than she could afford. The rescuer knelt beside her, whispering words that had no real shape, just fragments of comfort, the kind humans speak when silence feels too cruel. "Stay with me, just hold on. Please, hold on." Water boiled for tea on the stove, but the rescuer barely noticed. Instead, they rubbed her frail body with a towel, drying the rain, trying to coax warmth back into a frame that had nearly surrendered to cold. Her nose was dry, cracked. When the rescuer touched her paw, she twitched, barely perceptible, but enough to show the thread between them had not snapped. The night stretched long. The dog's breaths rattled shallow, sometimes pausing just long enough to force the rescuer to lean closer, to listen for the faint rise of her chest. Each time, relief flooded when the next breath came. Outside, thunder rolled, but inside, the sound of her fragile breathing became the storm itself. There was doubt, a heavy, a gnawing certainty that perhaps she would not live until morning. Even the rescuer's whispered encouragements felt like lies spoken to comfort a dying soul. Yet just before dawn, when the world outside shifted from storm black to the soft bruising of gray light, the dog stirred. She lifted her head weakly, only to let it fall again. It was nothing, a movement so small it could be mistaken for a reflex. But it was also everything. It was her whisper of defiance, her refusal to give up the fight. The rescuer leaned forward, tears wetting their own cheeks, and whispered the first true words since the alley. "You want to live, I see it." And so began the slow burn of a fragile flame refusing to go out. Days turned into a ritual of care. Syringes filled with broth, warm blankets tucked around her body, soft music playing not for her ears perhaps, but for the silence that threatened to swallow the room. At first, she barely moved, but slowly, like winter surrendering to spring, change arrived. One morning, her head lifted and did not immediately fall. The rescuer's breath caught, tears brimming as if witnessing a miracle. Another day, her paw shifted, clawing lightly at the blanket as though testing the earth again. The rescuer would sit close, hand resting gently on her side, whispering, "You're stronger than yesterday." Her eyes began to clear. They no longer looked like glass about to crack, but like windows opening to the world again. And with every day she survived, the rescuer's own heart found strength. What began as fear of losing her became awe at her resilience. The first step came like thunder, a shaky, uneven rise onto bony legs that trembled under the weight of survival. She stood only seconds before collapsing back down, but her tail gave the faintest twitch. That wag was more powerful than any words could carry. The bond between them deepened in the silences, the rescuer watching her sleep, listening to her soft whimpers as dreams returned to her fragile body. Trust formed not through grand gestures, but in the smallest details, a hand she no longer flinched from, a voice she leaned toward, food she ate without hesitation. The dog, once nothing more than shadow and rain, was slowly taking shape again. Bones were not just bones anymore, they were becoming wings. Hope, however, rarely runs in straight lines. Just as light seemed steady, darkness returned. Fever gripped her one night, heat radiating off her tiny frame, eyes glassy and body trembling. Panic filled the room like smoke. The rescuer sat beside her, wet cloth pressed to her head, whispering frantic words, "Don't leave me now. Not after everything. Please." Every hour felt like bargaining with death. Medicine dripped, cool towels replaced, the rescuer's own exhaustion ignored. At moments it seemed her breaths slowed again, shallow and fragile as they had been the first night. The fear of loss rose sharp and merciless. But then, like a tide refusing to stay out, she fought back. With each passing day, the fever broke little by little. Her body trembled, but she lifted her head again and again, refusing to let weakness win. This time, it wasn't just survival, it was rebellion. The rescuer, hollow-eyed but unwavering, watched in awe as the dog clawed her way back once more. And in her fight, something stirred in the rescuer too. A recognition that hope is not the absence of fear, but the courage to move forward despite it. The battle for tomorrow was not easy, but it was one she won, paw by paw, breath by breath. Months later, the same dog who once lay motionless in the rain now ran across the yard, sunlight catching her fur that had grown thick again, tail whipping in joyous arcs. Her ribs, once a cage of despair, were now hidden beneath muscle and life. Her amber eyes burned bright, no longer glazed but alive with mischief. The rescuer stood at the edge of the yard, watching her leap through grass, chasing nothing but the freedom she had earned. Laughter came unbidden, mixed with tears. It felt impossible to reconcile the creature bounding before them with the ghost they had lifted from the alley. Scars remained, on her ears, on her body, but they were not marks of weakness, they were proof. Proof that survival is not clean or easy, but jagged and raw and beautiful. As evening fell, The dog returned, pressing her head into the rescuer's hand, a gesture simple yet heavy with meaning. They stayed like that, quiet, the last light of the sun painting them in gold. She had been too weak to live. They had thought her story would end in the rain. But she fought back. And now, every breath, every step, every wag of her tail was a victory. The story closed not in shadow, but in light, the kind that remains after storms, steady and eternal. Seasons turned. Where there had once been a fragile dog trembling beneath blankets, there was now a creature of strength, muscle flowing beneath her coat, tail arching like a banner. Yet it wasn't just her body that had healed. It was her spirit. She no longer watched the world with guarded suspicion. Instead, she greeted each morning with a bark that carried through the neighborhood, a sound that said, "I am here. I am alive." The rescuer often thought back to that night in the alley, to the sight of her ribs heaving under rainlight, to the way her eyes had barely opened. Sometimes it felt like a dream, sometimes it haunted them, how close she had been to vanishing. But each time she curled at their feet, sighing into deep, contented sleep, the memory softened. It became not a wound, but a reminder. Word of her story spread first to friends, then through photographs shared online. People who had never touched her fur or heard her bark wept at the sight of her transformation. Messages arrived. "I needed this today. She gives me hope." Her fight became more than her own. It became a mirror for anyone who had ever been told they were too weak, too broken, too far gone. One evening, as dusk settled and fireflies blinked like distant stars, the rescuer sat on the porch steps. She lay beside them, head resting against their knee. The air was cool, and in the silence between them, a truth shimmered: this dog had not simply survived. She had carried them both through something greater. She had shown that life clings, resists, and rises again, even when no one believes it can. Her scars glistened in the fading light, no longer marks of what was lost but symbols of what was won. And as the night deepened, her steady breathing folded into the rhythm of the world. A soft reminder that sometimes the weakest among us hold the fiercest will to live. The alley was far behind, only light remained. Time, like rain, moves quietly until you look back and see what it has carved. The alley where she was found still exists, narrow, damp, the gutter dripping into the same cracked pavement. But now, when the rescuer walks past it, there is no fear, no heaviness. Instead, there is memory, and with memory, gratitude. Beside them, the dog walks strong, her paws clicking against the sidewalk. Strangers stop to smile at her now, children reaching tentative hands to stroke her fur. She leans into their touch without hesitation, tail wagging with ease. No one looking at her today would believe she had once been written off as too weak to live. Yet her body carries the proof. The faint scars across her ears, the way her gait still stiffens in cold weather. These are her history etched into flesh. But they are not limitations, they are declarations. Each scar says, "I was broken, but I endured." The rescuer often finds themselves studying her in quiet moments. At night, when she sprawls across the bed, legs twitching as if running through dreams. At dawn, when she bounds across dew-soaked grass, her silhouette gilded by sunrise. They realize she has become more than a companion. She is a living symbol of resistance, a reminder that even in the darkest rain, light waits to return. Sometimes, people still ask, "Why did you stop that night? Why her when so many others are left unseen?" The rescuer never has a clean answer. Maybe it was instinct, maybe fate, maybe the way her eyes flickered open at just the right second. What they do know is this: saving her had saved something in themselves. The dog's survival was not a solitary fight, it was a tether pulling them both out of shadow. And so, as seasons continue to turn, they walk forward together. The alley behind them, the open road ahead. The storm long past, yet never forgotten. For in her amber eyes, steady and unbroken, lives a truth that silence cannot erase. She was once the shadow in the rain, but now she walks only where shadows cannot follow. There is a park on the edge of town where children laugh freely, where joggers trace the winding paths, where autumn leaves gather in gold-red piles. It is here she runs now, no longer the frail shadow carried from an alley, but a creature of strength and play. People pause when they see her. Her joy is contagious, her vitality impossible to ignore. Strangers ask her name, ask her story. The rescuer tells it softly, watching their faces change as they listen. Disbelief, then sorrow, then something brighter. Her story spreads like light through a window cracked open. A woman grieving her own losses pets her and whispers, "If she could survive that, maybe I can too." A boy afraid of hospitals kneels to touch her scars, hearing how she healed, and finds courage for his own battle. She has become more than a dog. She has become a bridge between pain and hope. The rescuer often wonders if she knows, if somewhere deep in the marrow of her memory, she remembers the rain, the hunger, the cold. Sometimes in her dreams, she whimpers, legs twitching as though running from ghosts. But when she wakes, she always presses herself closer, nuzzling against the rescuer's chest as if to say the past is behind us. The light is here. Every breath she takes now feels like a gift extended outward, not just for the one who found her, but for everyone who sees her and believes again in resilience. Her survival is no longer just hers. It belongs to all who have ever been told they were too weak, too broken, too far gone. And in that part, as the sun sinks and the sky burns orange, she runs one more lap, ears flying, tail raised like a banner. With every stride she carries a legacy, not a weakness, but of strength born in the darkest storm. A legacy that will outlive even her final breath. The years pass quietly, not with fanfare, but with the steady rhythm of shared days. What had once been an endless battle for survival softened into a life built of small rituals. Mornings began with the scrape of paws on the kitchen floor, nails tapping against worn tiles as she waited patiently for breakfast. Afternoons were spent in the park, sun glinting against her fur as she trotted beside the rescuer. Nights ended with her curled into the curve of a leg, her steady breathing becoming the soundtrack of sleep. Her body grew strong again, but time left its traces. The white in her fur spread like frost, her steps slowed, her once thunderous bark mellowed into a lower hum. To strangers in the park, she was simply a beloved family dog, but to the rescuer, every gray hair, every softened movement was a miracle, proof of years they had almost never been given. And yet, no matter how much distance the years placed between that storm-soaked alley and the present, the rescuer could never forget the fragile creature they had lifted from the mud. Sometimes, when she lay sprawled in sunlight, they would catch the outline of her ribs shifting beneath her fur and remember how those same ribs once jutted out like sharp warning signs. It never stopped taking their breath away, this transformation, this quiet persistence of life. As age crept in, she began to tire more quickly. Her naps grew longer, her runs shorter, but her spirit did not dim. Even as her legs stiffened, her tail still wagged with the same certainty, the same joy. On quiet evenings, she would rest her head on the rescuer's lap, amber eyes still burning, softer now, but no less fierce. The rescuer sometimes whispered into her fur, "You were never supposed to make it this far." And in those eyes, they always found the same answer, "But I did." One autumn, the rescuer took her back to the alley where it all began. The rain had washed the walls clean over the years. The trash had been cleared, but the bones of the place remained the same. She walked slowly, pausing to sniff at the cracks in the pavement, as though chasing faint echoes of memory. The rescuer's throat tightened. They wondered if she remembered, if she knew this was where her life had almost ended, and where it had truly begun. She lifted her head, nose twitching at the damp air, then looked back at the rescuer, tail swaying gently. Whatever memory lingered, it was not heavy. It was only a shadow, and she had long since outrun shadows. The winters grew colder. Some mornings she struggled to stand, her joints stiff, her breath labored. The rescuer carried her when she couldn't make it up the porch steps, wrapped her in blankets, held her against the beating of their own heart, as they once had all those years ago. The cycle of care had come full circle. Where once she had been lifted from the rain as a fragile flame, now she was cradled again, not because she was weak, but because love demanded it. And still, even in her final seasons, she gave more than she took. The rescuer often marveled at how she could bring light into every room she entered, how neighbors stopped just to greet her, how children giggled at the sway of her tail. She had become a quiet legend in their small corner of the world, a testament to survival and tenderness. Her story whispered across fences and park benches. The night of her last winter came softly. There was no storm this time, no alley, no fear. She lay on her favorite blanket by the fireplace, warmth flickering across her fur. The rescuer sat beside her, hand resting gently on her side, feeling the rise and fall of each breath. The rhythm was slower now, uneven, but steady enough to bring a fragile comfort. Outside, snow pressed against the windows, muffling the world into silence. She lifted her head once, just once, to look at the rescuer. Her eyes, though clouded with age, still carried that same amber flame. The rescuer whispered, tears already slipping free. "You fought so hard. You gave me more than I ever dreamed." And when her breathing finally slowed, when the rhythm paused and did not return, it did not feel like defeat. It felt like release. She had come into the world as a shadow, been carried through storms, fought battles that no one believed she could win. And she had lived a full life, rich and luminous. Her last gift was not sorrow, but the reminder that survival, once earned, is never truly lost. The rescuer buried her beneath a tree in the park she had loved. Spring would come, blossoms would fall, and children would still play around the roots. And though she was gone, her story lingered in the air, in the earth, in the hearts of those who had seen her run, who had touched her scars, who had felt the echo of her fight. The rescuer often returned to that tree, sitting beneath its shade. They would close their eyes and, for a moment, hear the sound of her paws tapping across the tiles, feel the press of her head against their lap, see the flash of amber eyes in the dark, and always they would smile through the tears. Because though her body had stilled, her legacy remained alive, etched into memory, whispered in hope, carried forward in every soul who believed again because of her. She had been too weak to live. She had been forgotten in the rain. And yet, she had fought back, lived fully, and left a light that time itself could not put out. The rescuer would rise eventually, brush the leaves from their lap, and walk away. But the feeling never left them, that somewhere in the unseen rhythm of the world, she still ran. Not in rain, not in shadow, but in endless light. Grief is a strange companion. It doesn't howl. It lingers quietly, filling doorways where a body used to stand, seeping into the hollow rhythm of daily rituals. The house was not the same after she was gone. The kitchen tiles, once etched with paw scratches, felt too clean, too silent. The rescuer would wake in the middle of the night, reaching for the warmth pressed against their legs, only to find cold sheets. Mornings carried a stillness that no kettle or radio could break. For weeks they moved through life half-shaded. Neighbors offered soft condolences. Friends left flowers at the door. Some said, "She lived a good life." Others whispered, "You saved her." And while both were true, the rescuer carried the ache of absence more heavily than the comfort of words. It wasn't the grand moments they missed. It was the small ones, the thump of her tail against the wall when they walked in, the way her eyes tracked them across the room, the gentle sigh before sleep. Yet grief, like rain, changes shape. It begins as a flood, drowning everything, then recedes slowly, leaving behind ripples, then memories, then something softer. One afternoon, sitting beneath the tree where she rested, the rescuer felt something shift. The park was alive with children's laughter, dogs chasing frisbees, sunlight caught in the branches overhead. It struck them then that her story did not end with her body. It lived here, in the tree roots, in the air, in the countless people who had been moved by her fight. The rescuer began to write. At first, just fragments, memories of the night she was found, the fever that nearly claimed her, the way she had learned to run again. Words spilled like confession, raw and unpolished. But as the pages filled, something else emerged. Not just memory, but testimony. This was not simply about one dog. It was about resilience, about survival against the cruelty of indifference, about the fire hidden in fragile bodies. They shared her story online. To their surprise, strangers responded. Comments arrived from distant cities, distant countries. People wrote of their own battles, illness, loss, despair, and how reading about her strength had given them reason to keep going. If she could survive that, one message said, maybe I can survive this. Her story became a lifeline, carried across screens and voices, far beyond the small park and the quiet tree. Months later, the rescuer stood in a crowded shelter, the smell of disinfectant and barking filling the air. Rows of kennels lined the walls, each pair of eyes staring out, pleading hopeless, waiting. For years, the rescuer had avoided places like this, too afraid of reopening the wound. But grief had grown into something else purpose. They realized her story could not end with her. It had to continue, multiplied. The first dog they carried out was not her. He was larger, rougher, with scars of his own. But when he pressed his head into their chest, trembling, the rescuer felt the echo. They whispered the same words they had once whispered in a storm-lit kitchen. "Stay with me. Hold on." And just like that, the cycle began again. Rescue became their life's rhythm. Each animal was different, some too fearful to trust, some too broken to heal fully, some vibrant and quick to rebound. But in each one, the rescuer saw her. Not in body, not in markings, but in spirit. That same fragile flame, that same will to live, flickered in every pair of eyes. Years passed. The rescuer's home filled with paw prints, laughter, scratches on the furniture. Photographs lined the walls before, and after portraits of the forgotten turned beloved, the weak turned strong. Her picture hung among them not as a relic, but as the root from which everything else had grown. Sometimes, in quiet moments, the rescuer still returned to the tree. They would sit beneath it, feeling the rough bark against their palms, and speak aloud as if she were there. "You started this," they would say. "You taught me what survival means. You taught me what love is." And though the tree never answered, the breeze through its leaves always felt like a reply. In time, the rescuer's work became known beyond their town. Documentaries were filmed, articles written. People called it a movement, but to the rescuer, it was always simpler. It was a promise to one dog who had fought too hard to be forgotten. The final chapter of her story was not written in the silence of her last breath. It was written in every bark that echoed in new homes, in every wagging tail bounding into freedom, in every family made whole by a creature once discarded. Her light had not gone out. It had scattered, multiplied, carried by others who had found hope in her name. And so, even as years stretched onward, her legacy remained, not in shadow, not in rain, but in the countless lives she touched. She had been too weak to live. They had thought she would never stand again. But she did, and because she did, countless others now walked in her light. At the end of every rescue, when a new dog stepped into the sunlight for the first time, the rescuer always thought of her. And in their heart, they whispered the same words they had spoken the night they carried her from the alley, the words that had begun it all. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges of grief, but it also humbles the body. The rescuer, once quick-footed and tireless, grew slower with each passing year. Knees stiffened, hands trembled, nights stretched long with aches. Yet the rhythm of rescue never left them. Even as the years gathered, their house remained filled with the sound of paws and laughter, tails against doorframes, bowls clinking against kitchen tiles. Sometimes, younger volunteers came to help. They marveled at the rows of framed photographs, the stories carried in each one. Some knew the tale of the first dog, the one they thought was too weak to live, but fought back, but few had heard it in full. And when they asked, the rescuer would smile softly, eyes crinkling, as if protecting something sacred. It wasn't just a story, after all. It was the beginning of everything. On quiet mornings when the world still slept, the rescuers sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling in their hands. The chair across from them was always empty, yet never felt vacant. They would close their eyes and remember that night, the storm, the alley, the bundle of trembling fur. It had been decades, but memory has its own gravity. They could still feel a heartbeat against their chest, rapid and fragile, like wings against a cage. The rescuer often wondered why her, why then. They had passed by suffering before. They had seen strays curled against cold walls, eyes dulled with hunger. But something about that night had split them open. Perhaps it was timing. Perhaps it was fate. Perhaps it was her. Whatever the reason, they knew now that one fragile life had rerouted the course of their own. As their bodies slowed, they began to write more. Journals stacked on shelves, filled with reflections, stories, fragments of memory. The act of writing was not about preserving details. They would fade regardless, but about keeping her voice alive so that others might hear it too. Sometimes their words were steady, sometimes blurred with tears. But always at the center was her. And as the rescuer aged, something beautiful happened. The movement no longer belonged to them. The younger rescuers took the lead. Shelters reached out, networks formed, laws were challenged. They were no longer one person carrying a broken dog from an alley. They were a lineage, a living flame passed hand to hand, heart to heart. The rescuer watched it unfold with quiet pride. They had once been afraid of death, but now, as years weighed heavy, that fear softened. Death no longer felt like erasure. It felt like joining, like stepping into the current of something larger, something already flowing. Winter came late that year. Snow drifted against the windows, muffling the world in white silence. The rescuer, wrapped in a wool blanket, sat near the fire with one last companion curled at their feet. She was old too, a grey-muzzled shepherd, eyes clouded but still loyal, still near. Breath came slower these days, sleep pulled longer. The rescuer could feel their body loosening, like a boat untying from the dock. But they were not afraid. They thought of her often. Not in sorrow anymore, but in gratitude. She had been the first flame, the reason their life had filled with so much meaning. Without her, the rescuer might have lived quietly, safely, without heartbreak but also without purpose. With her they had lived fully, achingly, beautifully, truthfully. One night, as wind rattled the branches outside, the rescuer dreamed. They were standing in the alley again, rain pouring down, cardboard damp beneath trembling hands. The bundle stirred, lifted her head, met their eyes. But this time she was not weak. She was radiant, coat shining, eyes bright like fire. She stood tall, unbroken, whole. She turned and ran, not away, but forward, toward light spilling at the alley's end. The rescuer followed, their legs strong again, no pain in their chest, no weight of years. The rain broke into sunlight, and ahead stretched an open field, green and endless. She stopped at its edge, waiting, tail wagging, just as she had so many times before. And when the rescuer reached her, they knelt, pressed their face into her fur, and whispered the words that had bound them together from the beginning. "You're safe now. You're home."